Today I'm talking with Mark Wolynn, author of It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. Mark tells us a fascinating story about how he almost lost his eyesight and his journey to the Far East to seek wisdom and teachings from various teachers who ultimately sent him home to work with his family of origin. In talking to his parents over time, Mark not only regained his sight, but started to see a deeper way into how to heal our early trauma. Through that, he's created a system that leads both the reader and the listener, in this case, through a systematic approach that's based and steeped deeply in science towards that ultimate healing. So please stay tuned as I introduce you to the fascinating mind of Mark Wolynn.
One of the things that well, first of all, I guess I just want to start by saying thank you again for taking time to talk to me about what I think is one of the most interesting and meaningful books I've read in a long time. I'm deeply appreciative of the work you're doing and was mostly struck about your own story and how that catapulted you into this process of being able to detect what's happening in your own body and how that's led you to helping people. And so I wonder if you can, this is sort of silly, but in a kind of quick synopsis, let our listeners know just what happened to you and how it led you to this particular way of knowing and treating trauma.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. So, like many of us, I had symptoms I couldn't explain. I had lots of anxiety and depression as a young man. And then about 30 years ago, I began to lose the vision in one of my eyes. And I was diagnosed with a chronic form of retinopathy, for which there was no cure. The doctors told me there was nothing they could do. All they could say was, maybe it has something to do with stress. But because of the way it was progressing, they told me I was likely going to lose the vision in my other eye as well. And I was pretty desperate to find help. And basically I went on a search for healing that led me halfway around the globe, literally as far as Indonesia, where I learned from several wise teachers who taught me some fundamental principles that were not taught here in our upbringing, one of which was the importance of healing my broken relationship with my parents. And before I could heal those relationships, I had to heal what stood in the way, though I didn't know it at the time, which would have been inherited family trauma, specifically the anxiety I had inherited from my grandparents, all of whom were orphaned in some way. Three of them lost their moms when they were babies, and the fourth, she loses her dad when she's 1, but ultimately loses her mom's attunement. And this anxiety was the real cause of my vision loss. I just didn't know it at the time. I had inherited this feeling of being broken from a mother's love. And this was what would have been passed down in my family. I remember, I think I tell this story in the book, I remember being a small boy, maybe 5 or 6, feeling panicked when my mom would leave the house. And I'd run into her room and I'd cry into her scarves and her nightgowns, thinking that I'd never see her again, Alice, that her smell would be the only thing I had left, which would have been true for my grandparents. They might have had a night dress or something like that. And 40 years later, I shared it with my mom, and she told me that she did the exact same thing when her mother left the house. She'd cry into her mother's clothes. And then my sister, reading the book, it was funny, said, honey, I did the same thing when mom would leave. And I realized this had been a generational pattern of this feeling that the mother's gone, this break in the attachment that was heritable. And then after healing the broken bond with my mom, the crazy thing is my sight came back. I didn't expect it to at that point. I wasn't even thinking about it. But a sort of an added gift in the inner work was my vision came back, and afterwards I felt compelled to share these principles that I'd learned, and ultimately developed a method for healing the effects of inherited family trauma.
That's really a remarkable story. And, when I think about scent, I think about how that is our first and most primitive um, of the senses. And that's such a primal move to run towards that which connects you viscerally, to the mother at that time. And also that you would have this remission with your sight is also quite extraordinary. And in my training and understanding, is mostly from a neurobiological perspective. I understand deeply what's happening in the third trimester of pregnancy in this intersubjective, neurochemical intersubjective field between the mother and the infant through the placenta, and what's being transmitted in that way, which you lay out in your second chapter in terms of, I think Bruce Lipton's work and others. And also the field of epigenetics, which you can expand on a little bit. But you've taken it further in that you're working with this psychic transmission, which is embodied, but it has a different flavor to it. So I want to talk about that also. But maybe you can explain about epigenetics and just give us kind of a quick, again, if possible,
My pleasure.
explanation of that.
Yeah, so what I learned personally in my own story is that we can be born into these feelings, and as infants, to use a computer analogy, we don't enter the world with a clean hard drive. There's this operating system that's already in place, one that contains the fallout from the traumas of our parents and grandparents, and we're born with fears and feelings that don't always belong to us, and it's actually even more than psychic, it's biological.
Right.
And for that, we have to just even look at the nature of trauma. When a trauma happens, it changes us. Literally, it causes a chemical change in the DNA, and that change can and then the way that our genes have changed, the way that our genes are functioning can exist now for generations. Technically, there's a chemical tag which attaches to our DNA after a trauma. And then it tells the cell, hey, let's use or ignore these genes, which will better enable us to deal with this trauma that just happened. And then the way our genes are affected will then change how we act or feel. I'll give you an example. We can become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to the original trauma, even if that trauma took place in a past generation, so that we have a better chance of surviving it in this generation. If our grandparents came from a war-torn country, let's say, they're going to pass forward a adaptation, a biological adaptation. They'll pass forward a skill set of sharper reflexes and quicker reaction times, reactions to the violence of the bombs, the bullets, the men being lined up in the square, the people being shot, whatever they've seen. But they'll pass forward the skill set to help us survive this trauma that they experienced. But the problem is we're also inheriting a stress response, a response to the trauma, with the dials set to 10. And here we are, not born in a war-torn environment, but prepared for this catastrophe, this war that never arrives.
Right, and then the simplest stressor can activate an anxiety attack or a panic attack, and it doesn't make sense to the person at all why they're having this overreaction to a car screeching or something along those lines.
Exactly. We don't make the link that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression, our shutdown is connected to the events of our parents and our grandparents. We just think we're wired this way. I hear that all the time. This is just how I am. This is just, and I would have thought the same thing.
Well, we know from developmental neuroscience that the mother is, so to speak, downloading her nervous system into the infants, and that her original attachment style is made manifest and her mother's at the time of birth. So if you've got an anxious or depressed mother, you're going to get an anxious or depressed encoding of the autonomic nervous system, and that's going to strain the development of the right brain and all systems going forward. So there's that aspect to it. But for me, when I was about 47, it hit me like a ton of bricks that Hitler's trauma was living in my body. And I didn't put that together until after I'd done years of psychotherapy. And I think the work you're doing is so important because it's looking at our ancestry. It's not just our own personal psychology, and certainly our neurobiology, but my father, and I've written about this, lived under Nazi-occupied Greece when he was a boy. And he was in front of a firing squad multiple times and had untreated post-traumatic stress disorder. And I became a receptacle of a lot of his issues, insecurities, you name it. And, I was at a very fraught relationship with him for most of my life until I hit that moment where I realized, oh my God, this is not his personal doing to me. This is an army of people who have, quote, done this to me. And that was really life-changing for me.
Yeah, it makes sense. Sometimes our symptoms will appear, it seems like out of the blue, but that's not always true. There's triggers. For example, I found, and I write about this, I found that an age that, you hit age 47 or age 23 or age 18 or wherever, it could be a similar age that the father experienced these traumas. I find that not only ages, but there are also events or milestones in our lives that become triggers. For example, as soon as we get married, everything can be great, and then the marriage acts as a trigger, which is recalling some other marriage in the family history. In the book, I talk about a woman who loved her husband, but she felt trapped as soon as she married him. When we looked at her family history, we saw that both grandmothers were given away as child brides, one at 9, one at 12, to much older men. And what was so amazing is when I looked at each of the sisters in the family, I think they were a Lebanese family, the trauma expressed differently in the three sisters. The one sister feels trapped when she's married. The other sister marries a much older man, 30 years older. And then the one sister never wanted to marry at all, lest she'd be trapped like her grandmothers.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in my case, now that you mention it, my father was old enough, he was almost 80 at that point, where he was ready to talk to me about what actually happened because he never talked about it. And I got closest to him in his 8th decade of life when he was willing to tell me all of these stories. And there was an incredible healing that took place between the two of us, so that by the time he died at 89, I felt complete with him. But he couldn't talk about it before that. So that may be why I also had that aha moment, that simultaneously there was you could say a limbic communication taking place, or a body-to-body communication where we were ready. And I think that's one of the things I was really struck with in your work as well, is the deep level of compassion for our parents that comes forward, as opposed to being a victim our whole lives and blaming them, or the opposite, which I see with clients, is that they don't want to blame their parents at all. And so recognizing that this isn't a blame game, this is about deep compassion for all parties.
Right. When we look at, why our parents behave or act in a particular way, it's often a trauma sitting in the family history that blocked the love that was available, that blocked attunement, that blocked parenting, that blocked a mother's love, a father's love. And when we can look in this way, as you did, as you're explaining, and your dad's beauty at age 80, finally talking about the traumas, it's so important when parents, that when we can look with compassion, as you said, and our parents can tell us the truth, can finally share what happened in the history, so we can really understand. We have a coat hook on which to hang the coat we've been wearing all along anyway.
Right. That doesn't belong to us necessarily. Yeah, right. Or I guess it does, because I'm remembering in some shamanic tradition, maybe the Incan, that they say when we heal ourselves, we're healing our ancestors not just stopping the buck here so that we're not transmitting this to future generations, but we're also healing behind us.
Yeah, it's true. In a way, I have a image. I don't know how true it is, but I have the sense that when the buck stops with us, when we do the inner work, when we do the trauma work, I have the sense of past generations and future generations.
Mm-hmm.
We're the fulcrum in the way. And, that's one of the things I push for, is that when we do our work, it reverberates in all directions, particularly for our children who have no idea. In other words, if we don't do it, it seems to pass forward onto their plate.
It's true. It feels like a responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now, looking at some of the epigenetic mechanisms like small non-coding RNA or DNA methylation, histone modifications, mechanisms that are literally transmitted. We talked about we inherit the stress response. Well, what that means is we're literally inheriting an epigenetic adaptation. So the way they're looking right now, and they're connecting it with the mice they traumatize in labs. Well, let me back up for a little bit. So there's a lot of research being done with mice right now because mice share a similar
architecture.
Yeah, architecture. A good word. Yeah, 93% of the genes in humans have similarities in the genes in mice. Over 80% are identical. So we cause adversity to mice in labs, and then we can get a generation pretty quickly as well to see the effects in the subsequent generations. So where it takes 12 to 20 years in humans, it takes 12 to 20 weeks in mice. So what we're finding is, and one of the largest, let me say it this way, one of the most common epigenetic studies is separating baby mice from their mothers, or stressing the mothers out and returning the stressed mother to the baby mice, and finding that the effects can be felt for 3 generations, and then taking all the precautions to make sure it's not a learned response. So, for example, in one such study, the researchers prevented the female mice from nurturing their male pups for up to 3 hours a day during the first 2 weeks of life. That's it. That's not a lot. Just 2-3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life, and then looking at these mice that were separated later in life, their offspring exhibited behaviors similar to what we call depression in humans, and then the symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged. And then, surprisingly, in this one study, some of the males don't express the behaviors themselves, but appear to epigenetically transmit the behavioral changes to their female offspring. That's like father's going off to war, or the story with your dad, experiencing being lined up in in front of a firing squad several times, and him coming back numb and frozen from this trauma, but you, the daughter, carrying his fight or flight or freeze response. He's shaking, his terror, his shutdown.
Right.
And it's not just fathers and daughters. It's trauma's an equal opportunity employer. Unfortunately, male children and female children carry equally impacted by their fathers or mothers' studies. There's also all these recent studies that are out right now where, we look at the Journal of American Medicine Psychiatry, and they look at mothers who suffered trauma as children and found that their daughters were more likely to struggle with depression or bipolar disorder. And then there's a recent Tufts University study that found that men who suffered trauma as children were able to pass their anxiety to their children through their sperm. And why this study is significant is it's the first study to show that the human sperm mirrored the same changes, the same non-coding RNA changes, as the mice that they forcibly traumatize in labs when the mice are pups.
Well, that is powerful, and that illuminates a lot of what's happening socioculturally, which we could go on a big divergent tangent thinking about how the level of secure attachment has dropped precipitously in this country. And we think it's, just cultural, but the culture impedes upon us physically. And that is a pretty remarkable study with it being embedded, in the sperm. And that speaks to how we're changing as a species, really. But also just how, physical conditions are transmitted. We talk about, well, if you have heart disease, it's genetic, or if you have cancer, it's genetic. But we're not looking at, I think we are now more than ever, about how we're inheriting this, not just
begun.
It's not just biological, that if we really look at our early attachment strategies, or regulatory strategies, I should say, and what's happening with our parents, we can pretty much predict how people are going to die if we don't straighten these things out. And I think your site is a beautiful example of that you could have gone blind in both eyes had you not embarked on the journey you embarked on. We could hypothesize that. We don't know for certain.
Oh, I was expecting it.
Okay, so you know for certain.
I was, just along the way, I happened to do the work that cleared my eyesight. That there was a point, Alex, where I didn't worry about the eyesight. There was something beneath the eyesight. I talk about this in the book, but the me, beneath the sight changed. And that people would say, "How you doing?" I'd say, "I'm great." And they'd say, "You mean your eye's better?" And I'd say, "Oh, no, it's still the same." But the me beneath the eye started to shift, and then the eye followed suit, which was gravy. I never expected it to happen. But getting back to what we're talking about, even culturally, there's some very interesting work happening right now. With a researcher named Isabelle Monsuy at the Brain Research Institute at the University of Zurich. She's looking at the survivors of the 2015 attack in Nice. Remember when that guy drove up on the promenade and killed 80 people? And she's finding correlations in the blood of the survivors that are similar to the blood of the traumatized mice. So, the same RNA alterations. And she's also looking at Pakistani orphans who've experienced, a loss of mother and father, chaotic early years, similar to what they created in the labs with the mice, these unpredictable separations from their mothers. And again, these similar small non-coding RNA alterations, similar biomarkers in mice and humans. So that's been a big shift, because one of the objections about this epigenetic transfer has been, well, we can see it in mice, what about humans? Well, now we're being able to make the link that what we're observing in mice is also taking place in human blood, human sperm, human brain.
Right, which makes a lot of sense, just all the way around. And it's also very exciting to see that we're moving in these directions, and how that translates into early child care and education in our culture remains to be seen, because we have all of this unbelievably powerful information about how to prevent, how to be with, how to tend to, and I'm not sure how and when it's being used. And my hope is that our future is that we are educating people on the front end, not having people, come to therapists that are essentially the mop-up crew on the back end. So I just want to say that if you're listening right now, I'm speaking to Mark Wolynn about his book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle, which I'm sure you can find on Amazon.com. So Mark, when you talk about how to help people dismantle this trauma, or really go back and reclaim these parts of themselves, you talk about a language approach, which was really surprising to me, because when I think of language, I think of denotative language, I think of left hemispheric logic, linear transmission, like highly symbolic ways of communicating. And yet you're not really talking about that at all. You're talking about implicit knowing, a deep, deep bodily based knowing. So can you talk about how you came to conceptualize this idea of traumatic language or core language?
Yes. So I've discovered when a trauma happens, yes, there are changes, chemical changes in the DNA, but there are also clues that are left behind in our own emotionally charged words and sentences that I've found that create a breadcrumb trail. And if we learn how to follow it, it's like finding a piece of the puzzle that lets a picture come into view that gives us a context of why we're feeling so terrible, why we're having this depression. If we look at our trauma language, our depression language, our anxiety language, and then when we carry over into trauma theory, we know that when a traumatic event happens, significant information bypasses the frontal lobes. So the experience of the trauma, the experience of exactly what happened, can't be named or ordered through words because our language centers become compromised. And so without language to name what happens, our experiences get stored as fragments of memory, fragments of body sensations, fragments of language, fragments of images, fragments of emotions. It's like the mind disperses and essential elements get separated. We lose the story, but what lives is this emotional language, these physical sensations, this trauma language. And so that's what I learned to look for, to gather this trauma language, the pieces of the puzzle, the story fragments, and then connect the dots. And then when we do that, in a way, we, the therapist, we become the family hippocampus and we hold the larger consciousness, for the client who's still trying to put the pieces together. And in other words, we're bringing together, we're helping the client bring together what's been lost or separated, or help with the client separate out what doesn't belong to the client, these behaviors and feelings, or help the client integrate what's never been integrated, maybe these young fragmented parts.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense to me. When you use the word emotionally charged language, that then implies that this language is coming up from the body, which we now consider the deep unconscious. So it's an emergent experience coming up through the right, crossing over to the left, because otherwise it's just, as you said, there's no way to have a narrative about what happened when this kind of trauma happens. So it's an emotional valence that you're listening for, and people,
and it's verbal and nonverbal. So there's,
right?
There's this verbal language that I listen for, but also I follow or teach the reader to follow this nonverbal stream of language. It's the physical and the emotional symptoms that show up after an unsettling event, or the fears and anxieties that strike suddenly when we reach a particular age. Often it's the same age something traumatic happened in the family history, or the depression, the destructive behaviors that arise after a situation that's similar to some event in our family history. I find that this nonverbal trauma language, it's also mirrored in our relationship struggles, the repeated ways we deal with money, success, all of it.
Right. So when you use the word language, you're using it broadly. It's not reduced to, like I said, symbolic words, but the language of the body, the language of emotions. It's a different kind of language, and knowing, certainly metaphor is a beautiful language that bursts up from the body, and another way that people can start to communicate what really happened to them, because you even state at some point that healing trauma is a form of poetry, which I loved. I thought that was really a beautiful way of stating it.
Thank you. This trauma language, even when it's verbal, that we can tell so much about it. For example, if somebody gives a sentence like, I'll be powerless or helpless or abandoned or rejected, we can tell that that's the trauma language of attachment. whether it's the loss of the mother, or it even goes to early attachment. In utero attachment, I'll be annihilated, I'll be destroyed, I won't exist, I won't matter. So we can hear, based on this trauma language, whether it's generational or it's attachment language. If it's generational, we might hear a sentence like, I'll be forgotten, or I'll do something terrible, or it'll all be my fault, I'll lose control, I'll kill somebody, I'll hurt a child, I'll be hated, I'll be ostracized, I'll be sent away. That's different language.
Yeah.
You get so fine-tuned in the hearing the particular language that your client tells you, that just by listening to it, the thread of this language, you know whether you're listening to a generational trauma or an attachment trauma.
Oh, that's great. And that's a beautiful distinction, because I'll tell you that story about the young woman who cut herself until she was bleeding incessantly. And the story of how that related to her grandfather, I believe. Is that right? That was really striking to me, because that's a client that would be called borderline, a lot of different things.
May I tell that?
Yes, please.
It's such a fetching case.
Powerful story.
So it's a very young woman. She's 24, and she cuts so deeply that she almost bleeds to death. In fact, every time she cuts, she has to, her parents rush her to the emergency room to stop the bleeding. She cuts into a vessel, and so it's a strange sort of language right there. Why? I've worked with many cutters, but why is this particular cutter cutting so deeply? She's almost bleeding to death. So that's one piece of language we're listening to in the background. So one day I said I'm going to call her Sarah for the sake of the talk here. I said, Sarah, I'm going to give you a pen, and hold it like it's your knife, and put it close to your arm, and tell me that feeling, that thought, that impulse, that urge, that sentence. What's happening the minute you go to cut? And she takes the pen and pulls it across her arm like she's cutting, and I can see that she starts to dissociate. And I can see that she begins to glaze over. And all of a sudden I go, right there, what's that feeling? And she said, I don't deserve to live. And I look at her, she's 24, and I said, Sarah, what have you done? Did you take a life? Did you cause an accident? Did you break up with somebody who took their life? She said, no, nothing like that. And then in that moment, I know, following this verbal and nonverbal language. The verbal language is, I don't deserve to live. The nonverbal language is, I cut so deeply, I almost die. I know that it's not her language, it's generational. But I don't know it at the time, because this happened 25 years ago, and I'm still learning about this trauma. And I start to look at, her relationship with her parents, which was stellar. She had a great relationship with her mom and dad. She could receive their love, their nurturance, their care. So I go, well, it has to be attachment. So I start to look there. Nope, again. She's a secure, safe, strong attachment. She can lie in her mother's arms. She can be held and receive. And so I'm flummoxed.
Yeah, of course.
So basically, I luckily asked this question, tell me about your grandparents. And boom, she dropped the bomb. Her dad's mom was an alcoholic, and her dad's dad was driving with her in the car in the passenger seat. And the mom, drunk, drove into a telephone pole and crashed. She lives, but grandpa goes through the glass and bleeds to death through the windshield before the ambulance arrives. And in that moment, the whole story's told. So when she bleeds out, she's mimicking the death of the grandfather who no one can talk about because it's too terrible. And when she feels, I don't deserve to live, she's parroting the feelings of the grandmother that could never come to fruition, that she never worked with. Instead, she died an alcoholic when the father was 20. The father was 12 when this happened, strong enough to build his relationships with his parents early, but then the important thing is, you asked me earlier, what do we do to demystify this? What do we do to break the pattern? For Sarah, I put the two chairs out in the middle of the office, and I had her tell her grandfather, Grandpa, I cut myself and never understood why. But now I see the way I do it and why I do it is connected to you bleeding to death. Going through the windshield. And I had no idea I was doing this. And I asked her to close her eyes and to tune into her grandfather, who was obviously in the spirit world. And what was he telling her? And she was saying, he doesn't want me to do this. He wants me to find the place in my body that lives connected to his story, and to breathe out. And that's what we did. I had her find that impulse right before she cuts in her body, which I think was in her solar plexus, and to breathe out as though back to her grandfather. Grandpa, this doesn't belong to me. And she also then talked to the grandmother and says, Grandma, I thought it was me who didn't deserve to live. And I can see that this would be your feeling. And again, we found that impulse in her body, and we were able to bring a hand to it, bring breath to it, bring awareness to it. I talk about the Holy Trinity in the book, sensation, breath, and awareness. That when we can meet those intolerable places, those uncomfortable places in our body with bringing touch to the sensation, bringing breath to where we don't want to go in our body, bringing awareness to those places, we're able to mitigate, we're able to bring movement, relief in those places that have been blocked off to us. Even hypoxic, places where we've stopped entering in our own body.
Oh, that's really simple but not easy. Something so simple but not easy. And, this almost sounds supernatural when you're talking about this young woman carrying the trauma of this grandfather. And traditional psychotherapy, you could dig and dig and dig and never really get to this unless we're looking in the right places, unless we're looking intergenerationally the way that you do.
Absolutely. That was so startling for me as well. How are we going to get there? This is why I wrote the book, Alex. I mean, many of us are struggling with a mystery that we can't explain. That we have these unexplained anxiety, these unexplained symptoms, this depression that begins after a breakup or begins when we lose a job, but the breakup only was, we were only with this person for 2 weeks, and it doesn't make any sense, but it's recalling a deeper attachment story.
Yeah. But so your work, when were you introduced to family constellation work, and how much of that is what you're doing? Is that what you're doing completely, or is this an iteration of it as you've developed your skills over time?
Yeah, I've developed a way of looking. I employ family constellations when I'm working in group settings with people. Or in my trainings, I'm teaching how to do it one-on-one, how to work with generational trauma. But really, I'm working with inherited family trauma and a body-centered trauma approach to healing the effects of this trauma.
So this is, a unique construction for you. So I'm tempted to have you kind of take us through sort of the steps of how you do this, but I don't want it to get too reductive. I think it's really important that people read your book, or they come to your trainings, or come work with you. But if you were to give us some sort of idea, you talk about these 4 unconscious themes, for example. Might that be a way to talk about exactly what you're doing, or in a more concrete way?
That's the vision that I when somebody presents with an issue, I'm looking at one of 4 streams, 4 ways in which the life force available to us is limited. 4 ways that affects our success, our vitality, our relationships, our health, our sexuality. And when I look at these 4 streams, one, of course, is a break in the attachment with our mom, and that's quite a potent stream. Another stream is if we reject a parent, and then the effects of that rejection, which are unconscious, embodied and unconscious. I can tell more about that if we have time, but also I'm looking at when we've merged with the life experience of a parent. For example, we're repeating our parents' story. We're sharing or repeating a piece of our parents' life situation or life experience or misfortune as an unconscious way of bonding with them. And then fourthly, like Sarah, a woman who was cutting that so deeply she almost bled to death, she's identified with someone other than the parents. She's identified with a grandmother and a grandfather that nobody's talking about because the trauma was so severe.
Right, that she never even met.
Right, that she's never even, exactly, she's never even met these parents, exactly, these grandparents. And here she is carrying the story. In fact, what I've learned is the more something isn't talked about, the more something's pushed away, the more something's accepted, cast off, not discussed, the more likely we are to carry the effects of these hidden, silent traumas. But I think the bigger question you're asking me is, what do we do about it? How do we heal? And I think I'm glad you're bringing it up because there's a way out. Right now researchers are finding that those traumatized mice that they caused toxicity to in the labs, they can reverse the trauma symptoms in the mice. They can reverse them. So, for example, the mice that are exposed now, that were exposed to negative experiences, that are exposed to positive experiences, it can even change the way the DNA expresses. It can inhibit the enzymes, for example, cause DNA methylation or histone modifications. Those are mechanisms of transfer. But I don't know, I talk about these mice that were made to fear a cherry blossom scent in the book, and then they were shocked every time they smelled it. Well, they took those same mice and they taught them not to fear it by repeatedly being exposed to the scent but not being shocked. And then what was interesting is the mice no longer had a heightened sensitivity to the smell. That was one thing. But their sperm lost that fearful epigenetic
Oh, wow.
that could pass down to future generations.
Mm-hmm.
I start this answer by talking about mice, but mice aren't the only one that benefit from positive experiences. It's how we heal from inherited trauma. We've got to calm the brain's stress response, whether we've inherited it or the trauma happened to us directly. We've got to have experiences that we can relate to, that are meaningful for us, that can calm the stress response. And then we've got to practice these experiences.
Right. I was going to say this takes time because with the young woman that was cutting herself so excessively, there is something that happens, I think, in the system where we're so adaptive and so habituated that even though I might understand why I'm doing that now, or there's been an integration, the habit, the tendency might still pull me to do it, and I have to intervene on it and have to work against it.
Beautifully put, and that's exactly what. So for this woman, every time she would feel like cutting, she learned cutting is one option, but she learned also that there was an impulse, an urge that lived in her solar plexus, that when she could find that and then bring her hand to it, the Holy Trinity, her breath to it, even a sentence like, I've got you, I'm here, I'll breathe with you until you feel safe, breathe with you, and then start to practice a sort of mindfulness. That moment, her brain could change, begin to override the trauma response that had her cut.
This is very similar to the way in which we work with addicts, because these are habituated trauma responses that are terribly self-destructive. And all of the neural integration and the coherent narrative is essential for healing, but there is the essential practice of regulating oneself in the way that you're talking about, or seeking co-regulation from another and saying, hey, I need help, or I need a hug right now, or can you tell me it's going to be okay?
Yeah, exactly. And, we find that when we do these practices of integration, even if it's integrating pieces of the young fragmented self that either became broken from our mother, or what's crazy, what I'm learning is, and what the mice studies show, is that breaks in the bond, breaks in the attachment are heritable. When we're looking at somebody who's exhibiting attachment profile, we're not even sure if it's us with our mother with her mother, our father with his mother, because all this is heritable. But when we do the practice, you know, when we practice the feelings and sensations associated with this new practice, you know, we're creating a release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, feel-good hormones like estrogen or oxytocin, and the very genes involved in the body's stress response. This is where I get excited, can begin to function in a new, improved way. We can even change the gene response.
Yeah, that is truly remarkable. But one of the questions I know that people might be interested in hearing is if there's anything that they can do to start to break this cycle. And again, this work is so complex that you have discerned and requires really a skilled hand, that there's no way to reduce this into little sound bites. And yet I want people, I feel so excited about how important I think this book is. I really want people to pick it up and read it and consider the implications of it. So if there are any sort of tips you can give people, besides read the book, this would be a good time to do that.
Well, thank you for that. You know, one of the things I try to do is turn the reader into a detective. So the reader can be a detective of the trauma language, that sort of physical and verbal language that we carry in the body. But I actually do have some tips, really. You know, if we or one of our kids is struggling with symptoms that are, you know, that we can't explain, that don't make sense, that seem to have come out of nowhere, you know, we've got to look. You know, I say this thing, though it's kind of cute, you know, we've got to shake the family tree, but we really do have to see what falls out. You know, what family secrets have been hidden that no one will talk about, or what stories didn't get told, or you know, for me, what traumas particularly never healed all the way in our family. And then if we can talk about those traumas, you know, either with our therapists, or to our children, or in our families with our partner, and try to work through them so they're not passed down to future generations. That's always helpful, because, you know, if we ignore the past, you know, it comes back to haunt us, as we know. But when we explore it, we don't have to repeat it. We can break these destructive patterns.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing about the way you wrap your book up, is that it really is a story of hope and possibility, and really leading to love, which is our true nature. It's been buried by fear and pain and rage and a whole host of other affective responses that aren't really who we are. I guess one other thing I want to say, sort of as we start to close here, is that it's never too late to have this experience with one's parents either. I lost both of my parents in the last almost 2 years now, really in 15 months. And they were old. They were 89 and 91 respectively. But the things they told me towards the end were incredibly valuable. And it's unfortunate that they couldn't tell me when I was 20 or 30 or 40. But they told me when they did. And it was like the final pieces of the puzzle snapping into place. So I want to encourage people to not delay this process. You know, you only get one life, and the more integrated you are, the happier you'll be.
That's so well put. Yeah.
Right. So is there, do you want to tell people how they can find you, and any upcoming workshops or events you have, or questions they might have about therapy or workshops?
Sure. Feel free to reach out. I'm at markwolynn.com, MarkWolynn.com, also on Facebook and Instagram. Also, I have trainings where I teach clinicians how to use this work and their practices on 3 continents, in Europe, in the United States, and in Australia.
Great. Well, I hope that people do take a look at your work, and I very much appreciate you taking this time again to talk to me.
Thank you for having me, Alex. I enjoyed our conversation.
You're welcome.